Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Ben Kroposki. I'm the organizational director for the UNIFI Consortium. And today I'm going to give an overview and update of the work and progress over the last 2 years of the UNIFI Consortium. So first off, UNIFI, which stands for Universal Interoperability for Grid-Forming Inverters. This is an organization co-led by NREL, the University of Texas at Austin, and EPRI. This consortium is a forum to address the fundamental challenges of the seamless integration of grid-forming technologies into power systems of the future. Although we're really focused on how we get these adopted early into the power system as we are building it. The idea is really to bring the industry together and unify the integration and operation of inverter-based resources and synchronous machines. And we have three major focuses: research and development, demonstration and commercialization, and outreach and training. From this slide, you can see we have a large number of partners on this particular consortium. So a number of universities, national laboratories, and a large number of industry that includes both utility system operators and the industrial manufacturers of inverter technologies. Just a little bit beyond our members, we are also reaching out to a large number of industry participants, trying to get them connected and up to speed on what's going on in the consortium. And doing through these seminar series is a great way to get people up to speed on what's going on. So the first thing I was going to talk about today is actually the fact that we are reorganizing the consortium a little bit and streamlining some of the organization. So this is historically how we've been set up with our R&D areas, our commercialization and demonstration areas, and our outreach and training areas. And so we're streamlining this a little bit, combining some of the areas you can see in here. With the hardware integration and validation and domestic products becoming implementation and validation. We're going to plan to do more of the field demonstrations, and then we're combining some of our education workforce development areas and our communication and event areas. So our new organizational structure looks like this. Although pretty much similar focus really helps people understand what's getting done in which areas of the organization. In addition to that, we have several cross-cutting efforts. One of those that I'll dive into more details during this presentation is our grid forming inverter specifications. And we're also starting up some new cross-cut topics. These cross-cut topics really focus on how to address some of the near-term issues that we're seeing with larger scale deployment of grid forming technologies. So this is a little diagram that's really explaining how these various areas inside the UNIFI Consortium work together. So you can start on this side where our modeling and simulation activities as well as controls development are being done. These are influencing what we call UNIFI reference designs. And these reference designs are the actual implementations of grid forming controls, the models behind those, and then the hardware that is actually run to create grid forming technologies. These are actually being evaluated through our implementation and validation area. And information that we gain from these experiments are going back into both controls modeling and finally into the actual deployment of these controllers. Those also lead to what we're working on in terms of the UNIFI grid forming inverter specifications. And industry is looking at both the reference designs and grid forming specifications, giving us feedback on that so that at the end of the day, we'll be able to do larger scale experiments, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, field demonstrations at scale, and then eventually migrate this information into standards with the idea that this will eventually lead to grid forming inverters being deployed in the industry. So I'll touch real quickly on some high-level accomplishments that we've done over the last year. First, and I'll dive into this a little bit more, is the fact that we've actually set up the consortium under an alliance through IEEE ISTO. Again, I'll talk about that a little more. We've put out some information on the value proposition for grid forming inverters. We published the version 1 of the specifications. We've worked hand in hand with the NERC specifications for battery energy storage that came out at the end of last year. We've been working to identify the gaps and barriers inside existing interconnection standards. So IEEE 2800 at the transmission level for inverters and IEEE 1547 at the distribution level to make sure that there's no roadblocks in existing standards for grid forming technologies, and what we can do to encourage the adoption of these technologies. We've been working and coordinating with several international groups. Obviously, grid forming inverters are sort of a worldwide phenomenon, and there's a lot of work being done in Australia and in Europe on using large-scale grid forming inverter technologies. I'll talk a little bit more about these items here with the new grid forming models that are being used in studies, our 1 megawatt multi-vendor experiment, the 20 megawatt demonstration in Kauai, and conducting seminar series like we're doing today, and other industry tutorials on grid forming technologies. So first off, this consortium and the formation of a UNIFI Consortium under the IEEE ISTO banner. So ISTO is the Industry Standards and Technology Organization. And this is actually an organization that helps set up large-scale consortium and alliances. So we've set up a new non-for-profit entity under this. What that allows us to do is it actually allows us to take on new members through a very simplified process. There's a set of bylaws, IP management plan, and NDA that are part of the membership agreement, but new members can come in and join relatively simply. So you can see those documents over here, and people can come in as a full member, an associate member, or a startup and nonprofit member. This is really key for the long-term sustainability of the UNIFI Consortium and helps us implement ways of bringing in new members that can move this area forward. Another thing that we worked on over the last year was developing sort of a fact sheet around the value proposition for grid forming inverters. And this fact sheet, which is available on our website, really is a focus on the overview of the value that the grid forming technologies can bring to the system. And it discusses things like grid following controls and grid forming controls, so you can get a quick understanding of that. It also talks about how these technologies can be used to provide essential reliability services, black start capabilities, and improve power grid reliability and resilience. So this is a little quick cheat sheet, if you will, on how to understand how grid forming inverters will improve system performance. Another big effort that's been ongoing inside of UNIFI is the development of vendor and technology agnostic specifications for grid forming inverter-based resources. Now, these specifications really focus on what type of system level attributes are needed to make sure that the power grid actually works properly with a large number of grid forming technologies from multiple inverter vendors, and maintain stable and reliable operations. In addition, we also have inverter level requirements that actually define the capabilities that all vendors would be required, as well as additional capabilities that might be needed for some select applications. And what we're trying to do really is make sure that these line up between the system level aspects and the inverter level aspects, And this idea around these specifications is that this will enable vendors to build a single product that can meet the requirements of large-scale power grids. If you take a look at what's going on globally in this area around developing specifications, well, there's a lot of work being done, say, since 2020 around grid forming technologies. So you can see in terms of inverter-based resources, a lot of work that was initially done with 1547 being published and the various versions of that. 2800, which is for transmission connected inverter-based resources, came out in 2022. But a lot of work has been done in the past trying to identify what are the key characteristics around grid forming technologies and what are requirements around there. We published our version of these documents in 2022. The Australian Energy Market Operator, AMO, published a set in early 2023. NERC published a set around grid forming battery energy storage systems in 2023. And this year, we plan to put out a version 2 that incorporates a lot of the information to date and updates around these for grid forming technologies in March of this year. Again, what we're trying to do is kind of come to standardization across the entire industry in this space. So as I mentioned, version 1 is available and version 2 should come out in March of this year. One of the things that you saw in there was those new NERC grid forming inverter specs for battery systems, and we've been heavily involved with the development of those to make sure they're all consistent with the variety of specifications that are coming out on the street. One other thing that we've decided to do recently is actually set up a variety of cross-cut topic teams. And these cross-cut topic teams are smaller groups inside our consortium. They're going to focus on high impact areas to solve problems. An idea of these are listed here include understanding grid forming controls under constraints, look at stability limitations and interactions with multiple grid forming devices, scalability of simulation and control architectures, and certification. Basically, these cut across multiple different areas, and what we're interested in doing is understanding how we can address these in a timely manner. So I'll talk about these individually. First one revolves around grid forming controls under constraints. So really, when we take a look at inverter-based resources, one of the biggest challenges we have right now is understanding how these devices work when they're operating away from their nominal operating points. So an example of this might be a DC source from a battery or a PV system. It may already be operating at one of the DC side constraints. It doesn't have any ability to do upregulation or inject more power because it's already constrained on the DC side. And so that's going to impact how these actual grid forming devices work. And all of a sudden, your grid forming device may move from something that we were expecting to a different response characteristic because it doesn't have the ability to respond to those conditions. And so that's something that we need to understand a little bit better, make sure that there's some idea of how we make that information available to system operators so that they could understand the constraints that the DC side may be giving to these systems. Another cross-cut topic area revolves around stability limitations and interactions with multiple grid forming technologies. And right now we're looking at how do we develop stability corner cases that will really test the limits of grid forming deployments. Some of the early work that's been done to date has shown that grid forming devices really perform well on what we would consider weak systems. And maybe don't really show that much drastic improvement to grids on very strong systems. And so what we're looking at is how do all of these different use cases, if you will, help better understand the limitations or benefits of grid forming technologies, and then how they would actually interact with the variety of other technologies seen on the grid, like grid following inverters and synchronous generators and even synchronous condensers. So that's another one that we're focused on trying to get a little bit better understanding of. The third crosscut topic revolves around scalability of simulation and control architectures. So to date, a lot of work has been done on actually how to get single or small handfuls of grid forming technologies to work together. And that works fine. But if we start to look into power systems of the future and we see millions of deployed grid forming technologies, how can we ensure that we can actually model accurately the dynamic aggregation of all of these technologies? How do we actually ensure that the controls being used can scale to this level of devices? And how do we understand how these work together? So again, as we think about massively deploy grid forming inverter technologies, how do we make sure that both the controls inside and how we simulate and model these deployments work in an accurate manner? And then finally, a crosscut topic on certification. Really, how do we make sure that these products are doing what we need them to do? We're developing a set of performance specifications, but we need to start looking ahead on how we develop tests and validation processes to validate those specifications. So how transparent does this need to be? How do we account for the vendor and system operator inside of this? And how do we future-proof how these technologies would be verified to meet certain performance characteristics is going to be important topics. So these four crosscut areas really are helping us get a better handle of where is the industry now and how can it quickly improve to levels that would enable large-scale deployment. One of the areas that we've been focused on is building better models for grid forming technologies. And so a number of the members that are working inside of the UNIFI Consortium have been building grid forming models. We've been working with a number of entities to get these models adopted. So for example, the Western Electric Coordinating Council, WEC, has been now adopted some of these model libraries, and they've also been adopted inside some of the modeling and simulation programs that are readily used. And these models have now been used to help large-scale system planners better understand how grid forming inverters can impact their system-wide stability. And this is a good first step of getting the industry more familiar with this technology and better understanding of how they can be deployed. I'll walk through some very quick examples of some of these ideas. So this is taking a closer look at grid stability. This is from a report that's available. You can see down here that the WEC Modeling and Validation Subcommittee did in September of 22. They used some of these models that were developed by the UNIFI Consortium members. And you can see here that if we take a look at the western half of the United States, this is a very simple model of that system where you have 75 gigawatts of load and then a bunch of representative generators all aggregated together. So your hydro resources, your inverter-based resources in three different camps, if you will. You have your non-responsive version, you have grid following, you have grid forming technologies, you have your thermal plants that are not responsive, and then a resource contingency. So basically what this quick analysis did was take a look at if we were to drop 2,800 megawatts of generation in this system, how would these devices respond and what are the differences there? Again, I'll point you to this actual report, but it's a good way of taking a look at what the system can do. And so if you take a look at this graph out of that report, and if you take a look at this green graph in here, so in this particular case, the system was operating at 60 Hertz. The contingency event happened, so it dropped 2,800 megawatts. And then the frequency of the entire Western grid dropped. Although it recovered, you can see it coming back here and recovering. The challenge with this system is that this actually dips below the under-frequency load shedding. And so you're going to experience some level of localized blackouts from that under-frequency load shedding scheme in order for those generators to fully recover the frequency back to some nominal level. And again, in this particular case, this is with grid following inverters with a typical frequency response. When we take a look at what, if we replace some of these generators with grid forming inverters, we'll see that response here in a second. Another thing to note, this is around 73% inverter-based resources. So you can see once we do that, so this red line represents what we just saw, which were the inverters all grid following with a nominal frequency response. And this green line shows you the inverters that are grid forming now with frequency response. At the end of the day, this is a quick example to really show you that these inverters with the very fast frequency response and grid forming capabilities can really stabilize the system quite nicely at these high inverter-based resource levels. So I'll also point out a couple other studies that we helped out on. So there's a study from ERCOT called the Preliminary Assessment of Grid Forming Inverter-Based Resources in the ERCOT Grid. This was published in August of last year. We also have a nice webinar here from Yunsi Cheng, who is the Manager of Operation Stability Analysis at ERCOT, that you can watch the entire presentation on. At the end of the day, they did a number of scenarios to show how grid forming inverter resources can improve overall stability, especially under weak grid conditions. And another study that was recently completed was with American Electric Power and EPRI, looking at case studies for stability for grid forming inverters. They basically were looking at battery inverters equipped with grid forming controls and how those could actually, again, help improve stability on weak grid conditions. So just highlighting here some of the important work that industry is now doing using some of the models developed under the UNIFI Consortium. So how do we move from modeling and simulation to making sure that these technologies are really going to do what they say they're going to do? A lot of that is in our new implementation and validation area, where we're taking these unified specifications. Again, you can find another presentation that highlights what's actually in the grid forming specifications. And as they get developed, what we want to be able to do is map these specifications to some of the testing and evaluation capabilities that some of our members have. We're evaluating both fully controllable, what we call the grid forming reference designs, as well as commercially available grid forming inverters, and validating their performance to these specifications. In addition to that, this is helping start the development of the testing and certification procedures that will eventually become necessary to validate overall performance of these systems. Right now, we're doing this on a variety of scales, all the way from very small inverters that can be on the order of a kilowatt, all the way up to hundreds of kilowatts in size that we can do full evaluations of. An example of that would be our 1 megawatt multi-vendor experiment that's being set up at the National Renewable Energy Laboratories ESIF, or Energy Systems Integration Facility. You can see the building here inside one of the laboratories where we set up full-scale equipment. Right now, we're setting up and evaluating a wide variety. I think we have 5 or 6 vendors providing grid forming inverters. And we're evaluating how these all work in concert together. So either individually or in multitudes together. We're evaluating these testing protocol and evaluating overall power quality, overload capability, transient stability, and all of the specifications for grid forming inverters. One of the interesting things that we've seen to date is the fact that a variety of different grid forming technologies can be developed and deployed, but they all can come up with different ways of evaluating that specification. So for example, if we're going to ask it to do a specific voltage or power step, and we can see the different response characteristics in the output current from that step from three various manufacturers. What we're interested in here isn't necessarily the overall performance of the actual individual units, but how to ensure that their performance is going to meet the specifications in the grid forming specifications documents. So we have that ability to set up each of these green boxes in this diagram are grid forming inverters. So we have a number of different grid forming inverters. And we've been doing a lot of testing to date, looking at single or two together inverters and looking at the interactions between them. Eventually, we'll be looking at how all of these interact with each other as an integrated experiment. So in addition to this type of hardware experimentation, where we're able to actually set up and evaluate equipment in the real world, we're able now to take this information and then feed the results back to this specifications group to make sure that the deployed or the written specifications are able to be evaluated inside laboratory conditions. In addition to that, we're looking at large-scale demonstrations of grid forming technologies. And if you're not familiar with this particular example, this is the Kauai Island, which is one of the Hawaiian Islands. It's the furthest to the west of the Hawaiian Island chain. But the Kauai Island, the grid on this is operated by the Kauai Island Utility Cooperative, or KIUC. It's really one of the only places in the world where we have large-scale grid forming technologies actually deployed and being evaluated. So there are two 10 megawatt plus grid forming systems. Now these are batteries plus storage. So you can see an example here where your storage are these white container boxes and the photovoltaic solar systems are around them. This is quite unique in terms of place in the world where you have these large scale grid forming systems actually interconnected in a system that's small enough to see their interaction. So nominally, this is around a 70 megawatt peak load, and it has these two large scale batteries. You are starting to see some deployments of other large scale batteries, for example, in South Australia. But these systems, the systems in Australia are usually pretty far from each other, even though they are, some of them are quite large, like the 150 megawatt Hornsdale Power Reserve. But as we start to get real world operational experience on these systems, this is actually impacting the specifications we write, as well as being able to actually model and simulate the output characteristics of these technologies. One thing that I'll put out there, even though this is the one of the ones that we're looking at now, we're probably looking at about 10 different sites around the United States on the mainland right now that will potentially put large-scale grid forming assets on there. So we're continually looking for real-world demonstrations that are over 20 megawatts in size to help validate the performance of these systems and help drive the specifications. Currently, we're also developing commissioning and evaluation procedures for these fielded systems as a way to help understand their performance, and then come up with ways that people can validate that the systems will perform as expected. In case you're watching this or you're watching this in the future and you know of a large-scale grid forming system that's being deployed in the continental United States. We'd love to follow up with you and get more information on that system, potentially taking a closer look at it, either helping with specifications or actual performance of the system itself. So one other thing that we're actively doing is making sure we get the word out about all the work that the UNIFI Consortium is doing. And so we've been running a number of tutorials. These are typically connected to various meetings, whether it's the IEEE Power and Energy General Meeting. So we had, I believe, a full day of grid forming tutorials last year at the meeting there. And then we're looking at how we can do similar things for different conferences into the future. And the other thing that I would like to highlight is our YouTube channel, where all of these seminars eventually get posted to. We have over 1,000 subscribers to this, with over 25,000 views and 59 videos that are an archive of this entire seminar series. So very helpful to get people connected to this and bring people up to speed. So we're now in our sixth semester, if you will, because we run these in the spring and the fall for the seminar series. So with that, I'm gonna end here on with a highlight of our spring 2024 seminar series. All of you watching this in real time have already figured out how to register, but if you go to our website, you can register for the seminar series, or you can watch on YouTube after they get posted. But we have a number of great speakers coming up this semester. So spring 2024, you can see a variety of people, what they'll be talking on, how this relate to grid forming, inverter-based resources, and really pushing the edge of what we're doing in this space and how to get people more educated in this general area of how to use grid forming resources. So with that, I will say thank you, and we'll end here. One last little bit is you can visit our new UNIFI website at www.unificonsortium.org. It is a little bit of a work in progress, but it will eventually mature here over the next month or so as we migrate from our old website to this new website. It should give you quite a bit of information on what's going on the seminar series itself, and help you to understand grid forming technologies a little bit better. So with that, I'll end here, and we can start to take questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Let me just go ahead and stop the recording before we